Happy Sabbath. I was recently on a cruise ship in the Caribbean. I was at dinner with some co-workers when the captain announced that we would be passing over the Cayman Trench on our way from Grand Cayman to Jamaica. The Cayman Trench is the deepest point in the Caribbean Sea. It's a little over 25,000 feet. To put that in perspective, that's almost 5 miles straight down. A modern nuclear submarine such as the Seawolf class can dive to about 10% of that depth, meaning 90% we have no idea what's down there. I had commented to my coworkers something to the effect of, can you imagine what could be down there that we have no idea about? Being in technology, I work with very logical people, and the response was very immediate. There's no light down there. There's no way to support life. Absolutely can't be anything down there. So the conversation turned back to work. Coming into the church, we often find that fact is stranger than fiction. We learn that the spirit world is real. Angels and demons are real. God's created other beings that seem strange, cherubim, seraphim. But there are also things in the physical realm that are just as strange. Unfortunately, the majority of mankind doesn't understand or believe in these things, simply because they can't see or touch them. So, cryptozoology is the study of animals that are rumored or suspected to exist, but for which conclusive proof is still missing. And that's got to be a cool job. Your job is to go out there and find Bigfoot, see if he exists or not. So there are creatures like this in the Bible that we don't talk very much about. As I was researching this, I came across something which associated with the Feast of Tabernacles. I had never heard this before. The Jewish Talmud states this: the festival of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, concludes with a prayer recited upon leaving the sukkah, the booth. Quote, "May it be your will, God, Lord our God and God of our forefathers, that just as I have fulfilled and dwelled in this sukkah, so may I merit in the coming year to dwell in the sukkah of the skin of Leviathan next year in Jerusalem." A commentary on the prayer adds, "The Leviathan was a monstrous fish created on the 5th day of creation. It is told that Leviathan will be slain, and its flesh served as a feast to the righteous in the time to come, and its skin used to cover the tent where the banquet will be held." And I'm really not interested in Jewish tradition, but I am interested in what God has to say about Leviathan. As I was researching this, I was surprised by the conflicting commentaries. The commentaries are generally in agreement on the symbolism of Leviathan, but there is great disagreement on the physical aspects of Leviathan. So that's what I want to focus on, the physical aspects. Some say Leviathan is merely symbolic, that it's not a real creature. Some say only one Leviathan was created. Others say it's a crocodile, a whale, a plesiosaur, a sea monster, or a dragon. So we're going to find out what God's Word has to say about Leviathan. So let's begin with the basics. The term Leviathan comes from the Hebrew Leviathan, L-I-V-Y-A-T-H-A-N. It occurs 5 times in the Bible, all Old Testament. We get the bulk of the information from the Leviathan chapter, Job 41. There's an entire chapter devoted to Leviathan. So let's go to our first scriptural references, which is Psalm 74, verse 12. Psalm 74, starting in verse 12. Psalm 74, verse 12. "For God is my king from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters. You broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces and gave him as food to the people inhabiting the wilderness." So the reference here is to the Israelites in the wilderness after the Red Sea crossing. In case you're wondering, maximum depth of the Red Sea is over 8,000 feet. Notice verse 13 referring to the Red Sea parting, and then sea serpents are mentioned. Also take notice that heads is pluralized, both for sea serpents and Leviathan. It's said that Leviathan was given as food. We know from Ezekiel 29:3 and 32:2 that this is symbolic. But I want to look at it from a physical view. Therefore, if this is not just symbolic but real, then the food laws should apply. According to Leviticus 11:9, whatever in the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. So as a side note, we'll be watching to see if Leviathan has fins and scales. I want you to notice the word sea serpent in verse 13. The original word is tannin, T-A-N-N-I-Y-N. The original King James translates it as dragon, as do most translations. The NIV says monster. It's important to understand this word because it's mentioned several times around Leviathan. Tannin itself has multiple meanings. It is defined as dragon, serpent, or sea monster. So our second reference is in Isaiah 27, verse 1. Isaiah 27, verse 1. And since Isaiah is prophetic, again, we're going to be dealing with some symbolism. Isaiah 27, verse 1. In that day the Lord, with the severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. Again, the original King James translates reptile as dragon. The NIV says monster. Some even say whale. The reference to that day is the day of the Lord, Christ's return. At Christ's return, he will slay and punish Leviathan, which is what the Day of Atonement points to. I want you to notice the word reptile, again, is tannin, translated in several different ways. We see again Leviathan being related to the sea, but there's more to the story. If you notice, Leviathan is called a fleeing serpent and a twisted serpent. The word here for serpent is Nahash. When Satan appeared in the Garden of Eden as a serpent, it was Nahash, not a sea serpent, not tannin. So we see that Leviathan is related to the sea, but also a creature that can go on land, which we'll prove more later. This verse has a direct correlation in the New Testament. If you go to Revelation 20, verse 1, Revelation 20, verse 1, you see what this is pointing to. Revelation 20 and verse 1. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who was the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up, so set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years were finished. It's interesting, Satan the devil is clearly called by the terms dragon and serpent, tannin and Nahash. The same is said in Revelation 12, verse 9, after Satan tries to take over heaven, dragon and serpent. The word here in Greek for dragon is drakon, D-R-A-K-O-N. Most of us are familiar with that word, which is used 12 times in the book of Revelation. So while we understand Leviathan is symbolic for Satan the devil here, we still haven't shown if Leviathan is a real physical creature or not. So let's go to Psalms 104, verse 24. Psalms 104, verse 24. We're going to read verse 24 through 30. Psalms 104, verse 24. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions. This great and wide sea, in which are innumerable teeming things, living things, both small and great, there the ships sail about, and there is that Leviathan, which you have made to play there. These all wait for you, that you may give them their food in due season. What you give them, they gather in. You open your hand, they are filled with good. You hide your face, they are troubled. You take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. You send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth. What we see here is, this is talking about physical creation, the Genesis account. So, several key points here. One, Leviathan plays in the great and wide sea, as shown in verse 25 and 26. Two, God made or created Leviathan in verse 24 and 26. 3, verses 27 through 30 clearly show we're referring to physical life, because they need food, they have breath, and they can die and return to dust. And number 4, we know that sea creatures were created on the 5th day of creation, which is what this references. So I want to look at the 5th day of creation in Genesis 1, verse 20, real quick. Genesis 1, verse 20. Should be easy to find. It's like page 1. Genesis 1, verse 20. Then God said, "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth, across the face of the firmament on the heavens." So God created great sea creatures, and every living thing that moves with which the waters abounded according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." So the evening and the morning were the 5th day. So there are several interesting points here that this brings out. One, if you look at verse 21 where it says great sea creatures, the word for sea creatures is tanin. This is one of the meanings. The word great simply means great, huge, vast, large. So from the fossil records, we know that the plesiosaurs from the dinosaur age, the Mesozoic era, before this Genesis account of creation. Therefore, that's one reason the Leviathan cannot be a plesiosaur. The second point is we know that Lucifer and 1/3 of the angels rebelled before this account in Genesis. We know that Satan was already in the Garden of Eden. Before God created these animals on the 5th day, Satan's pride, vanity, and true character had already been revealed. Maybe it's a sense of poetic justice for God to create a physical creature that represents Satan's true nature. We know that many physical things point towards a spiritual end. The third point here is be fruitful and multiply according to their kind. This applies to the animal kingdom, including 5th day creatures. Consider the canine family, the dogs, from the small Chihuahua to the St. Bernard. Very different looking, yet they're all canine. The same applies in the ocean. Take the whales. You got the small pilot whales like they have down at SeaWorld up to the large sperm whales, yet they're all after their own kind. So in that, there cannot be only one Leviathan physically, since they were to be fruitful and multiply and would still be present when Christ returns. It was interesting to note that fish and birds were both created on the 5th day. This made me think about the myths of dragons. There are many myths regarding flying dragons. And so I started looking at flying fish. There are over 50 documented species of flying fish. And what's really interesting about them is their wings are not wings. They're actually classified as fins. So flying fish are not a myth. So our fourth reference is over in Job 3, verse 8. Job 3, verse 8. Job is having a rough day. He's really lamenting. He's actually cursing the day of his birth here. Job 3, verse 8. It's a very short verse. May those curse it who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. It's interesting to note that Job knew about Leviathan before God expounded on it in Job 41. So let's go to Job 41, verse 1, the Leviathan chapter. The entire chapter talks about Leviathan. There's a lot of symbolism here, but I want you to keep your eye tuned to the physical aspects because we're looking for what Leviathan really is. Before we go there, you need to understand the context of Job. God was putting Job in his place, and he was doing that by imparting knowledge that Job didn't know. And he specifically was using creation. In this instance, he was using the animal kingdom. There are 12 animals named here, starting with the lion to the raven, down to the eagle. The first 10 we're very familiar with. We can find these any day of the week. The last 2 are not familiar to many people at all. Behemoth and then Leviathan. And it's interesting to note that Leviathan is the final admonition in Job. It's like the icing on the cake, the grand finale. Once God's done with this, there's nothing else that needs to be said. So let's start in Job 41 and verse 1. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? And that's interesting. It talks about Leviathan speaking, which is symbolic, but we also have many myths about dragons who can talk, right? Continuing in verse 4, will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? So right there, we're clearly, crocodiles and whales are both already out of the picture. Verse 8, lay your hand on him, remember the battle, never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is vain. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, or his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. So Leviathan clearly has scales. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. The English language doesn't have many descriptions for fire-breathing creatures. 22, strength dwells in his neck, and sorrow dances before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him and cannot be moved. His heart is as hard as stone, even as hard as the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. Because of his crashings, they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does spear, dart, or javelin. He regards iron as straw, and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones become like stubble to him. Darts are regarded as straw. He laughs at the threat of javelins. His undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. Mire here meaning mud. This is a transition from water to land. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. On earth there is nothing like him, which is made without fear. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. So it's interesting, the main descriptions that we have here, and I know many of them are symbolic. In the commentaries, the closest one that I could find was the King James Version Old Testament Hebrew lexicon for Leviathan, and this is what it says. Leviathan, sea monster, dragon, a large aquatic animal, perhaps the extinct dinosaur plesiosaur, except exact meaning unknown. Their commentary is why I really put this in here. Quote, some think this to be a crocodile, but from the description in Job 41, this is patently absurd. It appears to be a large fire-breathing animal of some sort. Just as the bombardier beetle has an explosion-producing mechanism, so the great sea dragon may have an explosive-producing mechanism to enable it to be a real fire-breathing dragon. I also want to quote from the Good News Bible reading program, where they talk about Job 41. You can find that in the April 15th, 2005 edition. They go verse for verse through this, and it's really good reading. But in the end, here's a quote. It seems obvious that the description here is of some kind of fire-breathing sea dragon. So from the dawn of time, there have been many myths regarding dragons, but that does not mean that dragons are a myth, especially a dragon called Leviathan.